Professor Simon Hicks from the European University Institute, and Maria Joao Rodriguez from PES. I'm very happy that we have this very important debate today ahead of, we are all aware of that, of the next week's vote on the electoral law, which also includes the pan-European constituency of 28 seats, and also ahead of this weekend, the final session of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So this is on my behalf, and I, without further ado, also for efficiency, I give the floor to our group president.
Muchas gracias, Domènec. Buenas tardes.
Thank you, Dominic, and good afternoon, everybody. It's true, we've got quite a complex agenda ahead of us today, but I wanted to take a couple of minutes to speak on such an important event. It's so important for all of us, the role of political parties in Europe, political groups. We're working together with our colleagues from AFCO, Dominic and Gabi. Over the last few months, or indeed years, you've been working flat out on these matters, and it is absolutely central to our work here. So thank you very much indeed for your commitment to this task. Now, this type of meeting is very important, not just in light of the upcoming European elections, but because we're living in extraordinary times. The pillars of our democracy, of our society, have never been more threatened. If you look at the recent elections in France, for example, the extreme right was very close to winning. And it's true that we heaved a sigh of relief on Sunday. But 42% of vote, 42% support for the extreme right in a country such as France really should give us food for thought. We need to think about what's happening in our societies. We need to look at our reactions as individuals and as political bodies. Because only if we do this will we be able to identify the right initiatives to change this trend in the future. So it's important we get together to think about this. There's been a considerable downturn in support for traditional right and left wings, and this has given rise to a political stage which is ever more polarized, and we've seen this in France. The traditional left and right completely lost out, and you can see that votes were split between the extreme left and extreme right, and this leads us into a downward spiral, because the kingmakers, as it were, end up being the extremes. And it seemed that Le Pen was able to pass herself off as almost as a centrist, because there was someone yet further to the right than she was. So she wasn't the most extreme, and people could justify a vote for her by saying, well, it could be worse. So for the future of France and for the future of all member states, indeed, we do have to bear in mind just how close the extreme right was to power, thanks to this ever more polarized situation. Now, I think that strong political parties are absolutely crucial for a healthy and stable democracy. Now, this applies on all levels, local, regional, national, and indeed European. Now, of course, representative democracy can be improved with different types of measures, such as increasing participation of civil society, but this should not replace the role of traditional parties. What we have to do as traditional political groups is continue adapting to an ever-changing world. We have to adapt our communication methods. We have to find a way of communicating with a younger society, find different communication methods, social media, for example. We've talked very often at the problems faced by traditional representative bodies, such as trade unions, for example. It's not just the political parties who are worried about how to adapt to the new setup. It's trade unions and others as well. So we want to participate, but we do have to do it differently do we have done in the past. There's less of a formal structure than there has been. So how can traditional political parties, political groups continue to work and remain in touch with society, a society which is very different to it was before? This means, does this mean we should be working together with, I don't know, the neighborhood associations of our towns, for example? Before we might have done that, but now neighborhood associations, for example, don't represent the neighborhoods. There are different forms of communication, different ways of getting together and acting. So political parties are more important than ever before because we have to forge compromises, not just on a political level, but also on an international level, working together with our political families in other countries as well. This is particularly important for European political parties. We are part of the Social Democrat political family, of course, but we are aware of the specific problems faced by the party in each country on a national level. This is why we are going to have to adapt our approach and act with more empathy and respect for the national characteristics. There's an awful lot that brings us together, our social democratic values, but each country is very different, and we're going to have to learn to work on that. Then there's an added layer of complexity on a European level. We know that the Union isn't a discrete body that takes decisions and lets them be implemented across Europe. We are an ever-changing body that needs to represent citizens. It's a two-way street, and often national policies show that true politics is not done in Brussels. We don't always have an impact. On a national level, citizens tend to think of political successes as a national success and political failures as a European failure. If something goes well on an EU level, then we tend to take credit for ourselves on a national level. But if there's something that we're all responsible for across the board, then we tend to say that we were forced into it by the EU. Now, that's one way of living, one way of acting, but as time goes on and the EU is blamed time and time again for everything that goes wrong and is unable to take credit, then it's not surprising to see the rise of anti-European forces. I think that some parties are going to have to look at how to take a more European approach rather than dealing with European issues as a case apart from national issues. European policy is and should be domestic policy. It's not foreign policy. We are taking decisions, we are working on policies that impact people's daily lives. So European policy is domestic policy, is national policy, and we have to take that as our starting point. We cannot make the EU a scapegoat rather than accepting a joint responsibility and for successes and failures, because this will have consequences further down the line, which could well be serious. If you look at Brexit, for example, political parties have a key role to play in strengthening democracy, European democracy. They have to set out alternatives. They have to explain on a European level that decisions will be different depending on the political party which forms a majority in the European Parliament. But of course, institutions as they are, the way in which they are set up, means that compromises have to be reached, and it's almost impossible, not completely impossible, but almost possible for there to be an absolute majority, unlike what might happen on a national level in some countries. With an eye on the European elections, we are faced with serious problems vis-à-vis the rules affecting broadcast platforms, which have not accepted yet that they have a cross-border function. Different approaches are taken in different countries, and that's a challenge we're going to have to deal with as well. In some member states, there are problems with the independence of the judiciary, which could give rise to problems with upcoming elections. In some member countries, the supremacy of EU legislation is being called into question. This is legislation which forms the foundations of our European project. I hope that even though Orban won once again in Hungary, I very much hope that the outcome of elections in France or indeed in Slovenia last weekend could provide us with a push in another direction. This is more crucial than ever because we find ourselves faced with extraordinary situations that we never thought would happen in the last few decades, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine. We have to have one thing very clear. We can never take democracy for granted. We have to continue to fight for it. And political parties, political groupings will be a tool that can be used by citizens to communicate or express their concerns. And this has to happen on a European level as well. And I think there's an awful lot of work that we need to do this and educating younger generations, those who are born and have grown up living in a democracy. And this often means very often that they're not aware of what the alternative could be. They're not aware of the fact that you have to fight for a democracy on a daily basis. The rights that we have acquired could also be taken away. And this means we have a responsibility as political parties and as European political families. And I hope that our work this afternoon will contribute to this fight so that we can go home with something to think about and we can continue to fight to achieve these very important goals. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave you now to work on the program for today, but I very much hope that my colleagues will tell me what's been decided this afternoon.
Irache, antes de que te retires.
Irache, before you leave, I wanted to thank you for your comments. This isn't. I'm speaking off record, as it were, because I think few words of introduction, of welcome, but I think you've said a great deal more. There were 3 key ideas contained in your presentation. Look at the example of France. Perhaps not relevant to European political parties in and of themselves, but I believe that we all bear responsibility as a political family to ensure that this situation does not spread across the EU to other member states. We will end up with a political system based on one central party and then 2 extremes, and that's not healthy. Then, as you said, it's true that we don't normally have one political party that controls all institutions. There's always a coalition, either an implicit or explicit coalition. We have to work together with the Liberals or the EPP. And this will no doubt be the case after 2024 as well. But this means that the key question is who's in charge, who's leading the coalition. And this question has been keeping us busy for the last 20 years. The person who is leading the coalition can have an impact on Europe as a whole. Just one final comment. I've just listening to what Dominic was saying, and it's just occurred to me that in the work that we're doing here, discussions, debates amongst ourselves, we have to bear one thing in mind. The biggest danger for European democracy, for democracies as a whole, is an ideological approach to democracy. There are those who say, oh, it doesn't matter who's in charge, they're all the same, let's get rid of political parties, all politicians are the same. And we have to try and counter that. I know it's hard, especially at times when we've seen the world changing at breathtaking speed. This is something we have to do. We have to try and explain where we stand. We have to try and explain that now more than ever we need political parties as a structure to support our democracies. Of course, we've made many mistakes in the past, and political parties have. And we need to think about this. We need to think about what we've done. We need to work on making parties more transparent, more open to society, political parties that can actually change people's lives. We need to discuss this. But then we need to work to send out a strong message to our citizens so that they don't believe that politics is a homogeneous bloc and it doesn't matter who's in power. Because those who present an alternative, well, we've seen what's happened when someone claims to represent an alternative. We end up with systems which take us back a decade or even centuries. So let's work on that. Let's work to strengthen our structures, and let's work so we can be proud of what we're doing. It's a passion of mine, and thank you very much, and enjoy your afternoon.
Now, thanks again, Irache, really for these important words. And I give now the floor to Gabi Bischoff, our Vice President for the introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and a very warm welcome also from my side for you to our S&D AFCO seminar on the role of political parties and especially their role they have to play, they should play for the creation of a truly European space. And we just heard that we are discussing this in times of great uncertainties and also volatility of parties at national level. And also we are discussing this at a time where the last European elections are 3 years ago, and that we evaluated a lot in the last 3 years about the challenges, especially after the last elections and the processes, but also where we just have 2 years if we want to change and adapt it. And I think everyone in this house that comes from a pro-European party realized that one of the problems we are having is that the European elections are 27 national elections, for example, and that we need to Europeanize the European elections. So I think this is quite timely, and in the preparation of this event, I was just remembering the last European elections with Franz Timmermans as our lead candidate. And I think we were very lucky that he was so affluent, can speak so many languages, he could address a German audience, could connect directly with citizens, but he was not associated with the European Party. People were wondering, is he from the SPD somewhere? Or and what we can see, if we would go out into the streets in any city and would ask, hello, my name is Gabi Bischoff, I'm coming from the SPD. Do you know to which European political family we belong? People would stare at you and they would think, okay, I must reflect, and maybe 2 or 5% would know it, but I guess not more. So we know there is still a lot to do, but I think we also have to ask ourselves, why is this the case? And also, what do we need to change here on European level to change this? And this is also why I'm also a shadow rapporteur on the reform of the Statute of the European political parties. We as S&D, we never perceived this as a process just, to to have changes about finances or administrative instruments or something. Because at the same time, we are doing the debate and the work Dominic is doing on the reform of the European electoral law. And one thing is very obvious, and I hope we will be successful next week in really having a majority to modernize our electoral law, to really have transnational lists here that are sort of headed by a lead candidate, and also with a lot of other positive changes that are in this package. But one thing is also clear. We will never, in practice, achieve the reform heading a transnational list if we don't have real European political parties. It would not work. And therefore, I think it's very important that we connect these debates and that we will have very distinguished speakers today with initializing a very interesting debate how we can achieve this, that we can really play this role. And I think also when we look at positive experience, I would like to remind us that in the last convention, I think the European political parties played a key role there. And what we have seen now in the conference on the future of Europe, also the political caucuses, in our case, the Progressive Caucus, did also play a very important role, not only in strengthening the visibility and unity, but also in coming up with joint positions that were then sort of incorporated in the work of the different stakeholders in the working group of this conference. And I think this already shows us how important it is. But I think also if we build on these experiences, what would be the key reforms we need to do to achieve, to have really political parties on European level that play a key role in European debates and create this European space? Do we have national member parties that will let this happen? I'm wondering myself, because I often think we are very much complaining about the member states when we discuss how we can deepen integration, that they are very reluctant to give competences to the European level. But we have the same on party level. I think how eager are national parties to give more competences and to discuss all this, I think, is very timely, and I'm looking forward to the debates we will have here, and that this can also initialize some reform processes besides the statute, but also in our work, as we are all members of our European party. So I'm looking forward very much, really, and we start immediately with the first panel here, the goal of a European public sphere, institutional and political scenarios. I think this will then pave the way for the further debates, and I'm very happy that we have Pierre Di Giacomo from the French permanent representation here, relations with the European Parliament, and we have Professor Dr. Ulrike Giraud from the Bonn University, and we have digitally connected, I have seen him, Dr. Manuel Mueller as researcher, European integration and politics from the Duisburg-Essen University. So I think we start immediately, Dominic, with Monsieur Pierre Di Giacomo. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dominic. Also, thank you for inviting me to this debate. And I think it will be a very interesting debate. As you said, this is a very timely moment to be discussing these issues. We've seen a series of different elections across Europe, including in France. I won't go into that right now. We're also reaching the conclusion of the first phase of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And of course, last week in plenary, the European Parliament voted on the proposed new European electoral law. And I'm sure that that was going to be the centre of our debates over the next few hours. Well, I can tell you about the French elections that took place last weekend from the point of view of the permanent representation of the French Republic is that it's good news because the programme that we presented at the beginning of the semester remains in force for the next 2 months. Well, that's a good thing as we see it. And I think it's also a very good thing for the issues that we are discussing today. And that's because one of the main features of the programme that's in the first part of the document presenting our programme is reinforcing democracy in Europe. European democracy, but also democracy at national level. So we want to bolster democracy, and there are a number of different files where this is a feature. There's a package for the reinforcement of democracy presented by the Commission in November 2021. Within that package, there's a review of the statute and financing of European political parties. There's also a regulation on the targeting of advertising. And I think that that will also be an important factor in European democracy. When we're talking about integrity of electoral processes and transparency of democratic processes. It's also working in that perspective that the French presidency is expectantly awaiting the ongoing debate in the Council on the electoral law. It's one of the files where the Parliament has got the right of initiative. And we are impatiently awaiting the Parliament's proposal, which will then be passed on to the Council for debate over the next few weeks. Also under the heading of bolstering democracy, we also have the Conference on the Future of Europe. The Conference on the Future of Europe is an unprecedented initiative at the European level when it comes to participative democracy, as compared to representative democracy. Now, your group president, Irache, mentioned that we need to find a way to reconcile or reinvent the role of the political parties given the recent developments and given the need to involve citizens in political life in the EU. The political conclusions that we can draw from this conference over the next few days and weeks will allow us to enrich our reflection on how we can rethink how we best reinforce European democracy, how we best reinforce a political space, a public sphere in Europe that perhaps at present is too limited in scope. So, as I say, it's an unprecedented initiative, and it's very interesting to see that among all of the proposals made by the citizens, all of the recommendations that they formulated, there are quite a lot of things that already exist or are already underway, where the institutions, the Council and the Parliament are working, but our work is simply not being heard. I think there's this lack of knowledge of European affairs among citizens in general is something that we all have to work on. Political parties, Commission, other European institutions, we all have to work on this. Reinforcing the European public sphere, the European public debate. I think it's there's a need for everyone to work on raising awareness of European affairs, and political parties have a role to play there. I think we could all work harder on this. The texts on the table before us at the moment could make it easier for political parties to do this job. It could give them more tools. It could expand their possibilities to support their national member parties. Do that awareness-raising effort. Give our citizens the information they need about the debates going on in Europe, and thus make their contribution to reinforcing European democracy. I will leave it there for the moment, but I'm very much looking forward to the other speakers, and I will be happy to respond to them.
Merci beaucoup, cher Pierre. Je vais dire que j'attends les...
Thank you very much, Pierre. Well, I'm also awaiting that vote with a great deal of impatience. Of course, we are going to have to work very closely with you in the Council. We have to use these remaining 2 months of the French presidency to try and launch that debate. Now, we'll hear from Ulrike Guerreau, our friend, who's a frequent visitor to the group. You're from the University of Bonn? And your work is always very close to the political agenda. Go ahead, Ulrike.
Ist das Mikro an? Ja. Ich freue mich auch sehr, hier zu sein und danke Gabi Bischof.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank Gabriele Bischoff for allowing me to speak again at an S&D event at the European Parliament. I wrote my notes in English, but I see that we have German interpreting. I've been listening to it, and I thought it was excellent, so I'm going to be speaking German today, because indeed it is a very difficult subject, and I prefer to speak in my own language. I think everyone should have had a chance to read the report that's been presented on the results of the future of Europe. And I must say the results are surprising and very positive. Daniel Freund from the Greens sent out an email on that subject. Well, I think he went a bit over the top, but qualified majority decisions on foreign policy, right of initiative for the European Parliament, the European citizen status, tax cooperation, right for the EU to invest, competence for the EU over social policies. I don't have to list it all for you, but this is the sort of stuff that's on the table right now. And that means that the Conference on the Future of Europe has done an excellent job. I think it's a huge step forward, and the term European Constitution is now back in the air, that there could be a new constitutional convention, there could be a Europe-wide referendum. All of these words have now been stated loud and clear and are now on the table. Let's hope that in this change of epoch that we're living through, where we've seen a war against the virus, a war taking place in Ukraine, that this change of epoch can allow the Conference of Europe to seize these ideas and make something of them. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. However, let's put some water in the wine, as we say. Let's not be too enthusiastic. As Gorbachev said, anyone who comes too late is punished by history. Or maybe you've seen the film Titanic. You have to try and change the direction before you hit the iceberg. But then again, in the film, the ship still goes down. Oh well. Outside the bubble, outside the EU bubble, outside the Conference on the Future of Europe, and out there with people who don't know what S&D actually means. Well, I'm a lecturer. In the winter semester, I had 35 students studying the Conference on the Future of Europe. I didn't want to make it too complex, but just, what should I say? Well, they have no background knowledge. They don't know what Maastricht is. They don't know who Jacques Delors is. They don't know that we've already tried to have a European constitution. They don't know anything. And these are students at the University of Bonn in a master's class on political science. I'm not talking about Pierre in the Ardèche. I'm not talking about Carolina in Brandenburg. But that's the kind of people I'm talking about. They dream about Europe because they don't really understand what's going on. Yeah, democracy, Europe, etc. It exists. It's there. It sounds nice. But in that age group, they don't understand where this war comes from, whether we're talking about the war against the virus or the war in Ukraine. This beautiful democratic Europe that has always been promised, which they might have heard about and got a rough idea of, well, they don't understand why it is suddenly in such danger. It's very important for them to understand. Well, I was born in 1964. For the last 30 years, I've been working in and around Europe. I was able to work with Jacques Delors. But when we're trying to do education and awareness raising, we have to remember that we now have an age group that's coming of age on this continent, which is basically historically illiterate. Historically illiterate. They do not know anything that happened before the year 2000. And that brings us to the public sphere, which is the subject of our debate today. I had the chance to look at some data about European citizenship. Total EU positive. Well, that's to say, people who are more or less in favour of Europe. Well, the average is 54%. That means we have a pretty tight majority. Compared to the so-called, how should we put it, the Eurosceptics, the anti-Europes. You can see that you've got Macron framed as pro-Europe and Le Pen framed as anti-Europe. You can see that in countries where the electoral system amplifies dualism and this divide. There are other countries where the electoral system doesn't bring out this level of polarization. But even in countries like that, whether you're talking about Austria or the AfD in Germany or the PIS in Poland or whatever, if you look at the surveys, about a third of the population might be more or less for Europe, but not for the EU as it stands. If you say, if the EU could be better, if it could be more social, if it could be more functional, would you then be for Europe? What I want to say with regard to the public sphere is that when you have these levels of polarization, there is a tight majority in favour, but there's a third of people who would be in favour of Europe if these people who are not necessarily anti-European, but they are just against the EU in its current form. I don't think it matters whether these are people who are the losers of the bank crisis, who are against austerity, or if they are not in agreement with refugee policy for whichever reason. These lost citizens that Europe has lost over the crises like the bank crisis, the refugee crisis, etc., etc., people have been dropping out. This is fallout, not nuclear fallout, but these are citizens that are simply dropping off and going against the EU. Get against that third of the population. You can't have any kind of policies. 1/3 against 2/3, that's not going to work. The current deadlock that we see in all EU member states cannot be overcome under those circumstances. So-called populists are so strongly rooted in the system that it's pretty much impossible to overcome it. The deadlock that comes from this third of the population is huge. And when we talk about public sphere and a public debate or space for that debate, then that brings me to my second point. We have to work in such manner that these anti-Europeans basically said we could have a different Europe, that for a more social, more democratic Europe, well, maybe these people can be brought on board. The problem is the polarization of the debate, that they have to say pro-EU, anti-EU. We have to try and overcome that polarization. Unfortunately, you could say that the French election brought this out too clearly. Macron in favor of the EU, Le Pen against. We have to overcome that polarization. Well, okay, Macron is more or less in favor of Europe, but for many people with his neoliberal agenda, he is untouchable, and they could not vote for him, and then they can't consider themselves pro-European as a result. Well, whatever you may have against Marie Le Pen, she's not entirely wrong in every single thing and in everything she says. When she says we need to strengthen local authorities, we need to strengthen rural infrastructure, etc., etc., she makes points that do not contradict Europe's social and democratic agenda. So that's my appeal to you. And the second point, we have to overcome this framing of pro or anti-EU. We have to move beyond that and try and bring back on board those people who are against the EU as it stands, but who are in favor of European values. I could like to make a little parenthesis here that linked to the details of political science. First of all, the European public sphere is more divided than ever. There are two public spheres. Pro or anti-EU is just one aspect of this division of public opinion. If you look at other debates like the climate, or Putin and Ukraine, or COVID, you'll quickly note that across all of those three topics, there's a pretty standard liberal interpretation of how these ideas are to be looked at. COVID, Ukraine, climate. It's pretty much impossible to criticize the standard mainstream liberal perspective. It's very difficult to make a differentiated opinion on the Ukraine or the climate. If you see the way the discourse culture works and how it is linked to different social strata, you can see that the people who were critical of the COVID measures, that's to say, the lowest 20% of the population, the people who couldn't sit at home with their MacBook and work through the lockdowns, they're also the people who are most skeptical about the climate, the people who have to drive a car, versus those who live in the city and fight for the climate. Well, this is just a device to you, or something that I would like to see. I mean, I would love it if you would commission some research from me on this subject, that we need good studies as to how we could deal with this. It seems that there's a liberal discourse, which is that's a good one, which is pro-sustainability, pro-Ukraine, pro-COVID measures, etc. But we need to get beyond in favor and against that view. And we need to see how that correlates to different social classes or social strata. My suspicion is that an anti-system coalition would be possible in every member state in Europe. That's to say, it's a coalition that is speaking against the standard mainstream discourse. Well, okay, it's a good idea to teach people about the EU, but it sounds almost arrogant. That's one of the things that the Commission should be giving up on, this constant patronizing attitude that those who are not in favor of the EU are stupid or just have to learn more or need to get to know the policies and that they need to become more enlightened. As a political scientist, I can tell you that in Habermas's tradition, Klaus Offer, Bronkhorst, the systematic failures of the EU institution when it comes to credibility, accountability, transparency, etc., that you would be far off the mark if you say that the EU cannot be criticized. Rather, we have to criticize Europe. And we have plenty of areas where criticisms are justified. On a lot of these issues, the populists are actually right when they criticize. It would be better if we would stop pointing fingers at the populists, and rather we should listen to them. We should take on board their criticisms, but put it in a different framing. Anyway, that brings me to my fourth point. The fourth point is a pretty quick one. If you want to get beyond that polarization, what I would do, if I wanted to find a proposal for the Conference on the Future of Europe, there are two things I would say. One thing I said at the AFCO conference in December 2019, where I had the chance to speak. There's one principle, and we've heard a lot about European democracy, but there is a condition for democracy. It's not sufficient in itself, but it's a necessary condition. And that is the idea of political equality. All citizens have equal rights. And that's in all of their needs. Not just when it comes to roaming, not just when they go to a consulate in an African country, so they can go to the consulate of another EU country, for example. But Pierre Rosanvallon, the French socialist, said is that we have to look at the holy, sacred aspects of citizenship, voting, taxation, and social rights. If we are serious, if we have the idea that we want to build a European democracy, well, these are ideas that are very, very well represented in the report from the Conference on the Future of Europe. But what's missing is the sacred aspect of the citizen, the equal rights of all European citizens. I would be pleased if it could be stated clearly that that is a necessary condition for a European democracy. And then a final comment that's very important to me. For around 30 years, I've been working on the consequence of the Maastricht Treaty and ever closer union. What I see coming towards us is a difficult debate on the return of nations and the nation state. This debate will only work if we have a look at the French definition of a nation, not the German one under Herder and what Herder felt a nation and identity meant. Following the tradition of Marcel Mauss, a French sociologist who's the grandson of Émile Durkheim, it stated, a nation are the people who decide together on social issues. That's the modern translation of Rousseau and what he states in the social contract. We have a currency union. We are really a social union as well. And in the Conference on the Future of Europe report, I'm glad that competences for the Economic and Social Committee are to be extended. But if we are to enter a debate where the nation is played off against Europe, well, that is where we have the debate with Marine Le Pen and PIS, where we're talking about superiority, the precedence of European law over national law, etc. This is exactly the dividing point of the current debate. We have to try and overcome polarization, and the way to do that is perhaps look at the definitions of the nation. If to look at civilian definitions of nations, that a nation is a group that decide on social issues together. If we take that seriously, I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas for what has to happen in the public sphere when it comes to the welfare state, to fiscal union. And we should build upon what the European Council stated in 2012, genuine economic and monetary union. I'll make two final personal comments. This is the first time I've been back in the European Parliament since COVID. I'm happy to be here, but I wanted to take this opportunity to express my personal disappointment and two debates in particular. When we read the literature, people are talking about authoritarian tendencies. But if you look at the oppression of diversity of opinion and freedom of opinion, and I think that a lot went wrong in the European debate. I hope that Europe always stands up for its values and has another look and analyzes what has been happening over the last 2 years in Europe and when it comes to abuse of power and restriction of the freedom of opinion. Second point is that in the debate on the Ukraine war, I mean, it's a tragic war, and I get the feeling that banning Russia Today in Europe was not necessarily in line with what we understand and try to sell as freedom of opinion and diversity of opinion. We all know that Russia Today is Russian propaganda, but I want to be allowed to read it. I want to get my own idea of the two different perspectives of the sides in a conflict. I would be pleased to see a kind of European bias being removed from the debate. Europe has to stand for pluralism of opinion. If we look at the interests of the US and Europe, we have to ask ourselves if our interests are entirely congruent and fit in together in all cases. There's quite a lot that I've seen over the last 2 years, even at the official level in the EU, that I must say has been rather disappointing. And I'm someone who's been working for ever closer union for the last 30 years. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, dear Ulrike, for these very good points. And of course, again, it's a bit unavoidable to go back to the French experience, no? Because indeed there has been, in a way, a shift from the left-right axis to the pro-Europe, anti-Europe axis, strong in the. But this is an axis in which the far right really thrives, because it's easier to attack Europe and to make that kind of discourse than to discuss seriously about social policies in Europe, economic policies, progressive economic policies in Europe. You just go against the architecture as the project itself, no? So I always thought that by framing the political struggle in these nationalists versus pro-Europeans or globalists, we're basically emboldening, I will say, the far right and to some extent also the far left, because the paradox, or maybe not a paradox, is that Mélenchon is not particularly a Europhile either, no? So you have, I think, a very uncomfortable situation in framing the debate in this way. But we will also then have the debate. And by the way, I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that we have also in the room Cyrus Engerer and Margarida Marquez, MEPs. And this is much appreciated because this seminar is also for the benefit of our members. Now, the next speaker is in the list is Manuel Mueller. Maybe he's participating online because he's not in the room. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of European Integration and European Politics of the University of Duisburg-Essen. And he has published a dissertation precisely on the European public sphere at the time of the Maastricht Treaty. And his research includes European Parliament elections and European political parties. So, dear Manuel, you have the floor for 15 minutes.
Many thanks for having me remotely indeed. I will try to be brief and stick to the topic, and for this I have prepared a presentation, which I think you can see now, can't you? What I found very interesting about the kind of the title of this event is this framing that we are going towards a European public sphere, because in many senses, and next slide please, in many senses there already is a European public sphere. There are a lot of transnational encounters. People are traveling transnationally, not so much during the pandemic, but they are starting to do so already. There are European public events like the one we are right now participating in. There even are EU-wide media. So in many senses, there is already something that we can call a European public sphere. But of course, this transnational public sphere is mostly a public sphere of the elites and of the European experts. So it's the political public sphere of the European Union is often called the Brussels bubble, and it is so. The problem is that it's so small, and that the mass media. Next slide, please. The mass media have a mostly national audience, and they are directed towards a national public, and this then means that the political public sphere of the European Union as a whole is very much nationally fragmented. Now, is this a problem? One could say that it isn't, because, next slide please, because a pluralistic public sphere is always fragmented. And if you look at the academic debate about the European public sphere, this is a very crucial point that has been made, that essentially the problem with the European public sphere isn't that big, because it would be strange to ask for a public sphere that is homogeneous, that isn't fragmented in any way, because the national public sphere is always also fragmented, or we could say structured, along political lines. There are left-wing media and right-wing media. Along social lines, there are quality and tabloid media. There are, of course, also territorial lines, because we have regional media, we have specialized journals for every kind of topic. So also at the national level, we have this kind of fragmented public sphere. But, next slide, please. But of course, it matters which of these dividing lines are kind of at the center of political debate. Because, next slide please, because usually political debates at the national level are framed, as we all know, along partisan lines. Partisan cleavages are kind of dominating the political debate. The actors that are most visible at the national level in political debates are normally the leaders of the government and the opposition, which doesn't mean that they are the only visible actors, but they are kind of the most important ones. This implicitly means that the debate is mostly about the arguments and the positions that these political party leaders are presenting, and that means that the differences are the difference about which the political debate takes place are the differences between, let's say, the left-wing media and the right-wing media. So the entire structure of the political debate in a national democracy is usually along partisan cleavages. Whereas at the European level, a lot of the political debates are structured along national cleavages. So the most visible actors tend to be the national governments. The debate is often about national interest. If you think back to the big European crisis that we've seen during the last years, for example, the Euro crisis, which was very clearly a debate that could have been structured along a left-right cleavage, was very often in the public debate seen as a kind of a conflict between the national interest of different member states. And finally, if we look at how debates at the European level are structured, we often see that the differences between the discourses of left-wing and right-wing media from the same country are smaller than the differences between media from different countries. Because every kind of the big newspapers or big news channels of every member state are kind of focused on their own national government and the position of the own national government, which then means that often enough, more often than not, the national discourse is produced with the national framing and kind of national relevance criteria that mean that within each national bubble, discourses are similar and different from other member states. But, next slide please, this is not inevitable. We have this national fragmentation of the European public sphere, but it doesn't need to be like this, because the fact that national media, that the big mass media have a national audience, doesn't mean that this also has to be kind of the central fragmentation of the discourse, because as I've said before, fragmentation as such is not a problem for having a democratic public sphere, and it is not difficult to imagine a European public sphere that wouldn't be structured or fragmented along national lines, but along partisan lines. So we could have a European public sphere in which the most visible actors are the representative of European political parties, in which the debate is about the position and arguments of transnational European parties, and in which, in the end, the discourses of, let's say, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Le Monde, and El País are closer to each other than to the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Le Figaro, or El Mundo. So the question is, what does it mean that right now the European public sphere is nationally fragmented, and how could we get to a European public sphere that is fragmented along partisan line? Next slide, please. First, why is it important? The legitimacy of a political system always depends also on the structure of its public debates. Why? Because, of course, parliamentary elections are between political parties. So if you go to vote in a parliamentary election, you vote for a political party, and in the end, the fact that elections produce a winner, that some kind of party or coalitions wins in the elections, is a way to democratically and legitimately decide which partisan discourses, which partisan positions will be put into practice. And if public discourses don't follow partisan lines but national lines, then of course this is a problem for the legitimacy of the elections, because you can't vote for kind of your country's position in a European election. And if you try to, you will normally end up voting for a national populist party. Conversely, of course, having an intergovernmental political system depends on having a national framing of the public discourse, because if the dividing lines that are dominating the public debates are partisan ones, then it is more difficult to feel represented by your national government if you haven't voted your national governments at the national level, because you have voted for an opposition party maybe. So in the end, we have this phenomenon that the legitimacy of the political system depends on how political debates are structured within the public sphere. On the other hand, next slide please. On the other hand, the political system also shapes the structure of public debates, because, to put it very schematically, because of news values effects. For the media, the media are interested in reporting on political actors who have actual power. They try to kind of present an interesting story about the political process, also because media consumers are interested in this kind of stories. So for the media, the interesting question is, which are the great antagonisms that are present in the political system? Ideally, which are the conflicts that you can personalize, and who are the actors that citizens can also influence as voters, because it's more interesting to read about the position of someone that you can vote out of office than to read just about the position of some politician on which you don't have an influence as a voter. So the question, which political actors actually have influence on a decision, and which political actors can be voted out of office by the voters, which means the media consumers, are important factors for the framing of the political debate, because these are the actors that the media will report on. Now, in a democratic system, of course, the basic antagonism that is interesting for the media and that typically shapes political debates is the antagonism between the government and the opposition, or maybe in a more nuanced way, the antagonism between different political parties. And this is part of the reason why the public debate at the national level is along partisan lines. Next slide, please. At the European level, now we have the problem that the current political system of the EU, as you all know, lacks the dynamic between a government and an opposition. So there is no single basic antagonism that is shaping the European political system. But we have different institutions that are sharing power. We have the European Parliament with its transnational partisan logic, but we also have the Council with its intergovernmental logic. And in the end, the political system as such is very consensus-oriented. The goal is always to find a very complex compromise between many different interests, both partisan ones and national ones. And this process, this consensus-oriented process, is simply very difficult to understand. It is difficult to explain along this antagonistic lines that the media like. And this simply discourages media attention in general. So when we're asking why do people know so little about the European Union, this is to a good part because the European Union is so complex that it is not only difficult to understand, but it is also boring to report on for the mass media. Next slide, please. This, of course, then hampers transnational partisan debates. This lack of a government-opposition dynamics in the European Parliament or in the European political system in general means that this kind of central democratic frame is lacking. And it also means that European Parliament elections usually aren't really crucial turning points of EU politics. There have been a lot of moments when the EU changed course politically, but normally these were external crises and not European Parliament elections. So for a voter and also for a media consumer, this means, to put it bluntly, why bother about European parties' positions? Why bother about European Parliament elections if in the end there isn't this kind of moment of decision in which you have to see which party wins, because this party will then implement its policy. By contrast, if we have then a political crisis and if the European Union really does change course on a certain topic, these are normally moments in which the European Council, with its intergovernmental logic, takes central stage, which in part explains why the big European debates are often framed in this national framework of national interests and conflicts between national governments. But to finish on an optimistic tone, next slide, please. If the political system can shape the public debate, this of course also means that a democratic European public sphere, in the sense of a public sphere that is shaped by partisan differences rather than national interests, can emerge through democratic institutional reform of the European Union. Next slide, please. And some examples of these democratic institutional reforms that can help to construct a European public sphere, or to have more partisan political debates at a European level, are, of course, a lot of debates that are currently debated in the European Parliament. It is about strengthening European political parties, giving them more visibility, also giving them more power, because the more power they have, the more interesting they become for the media to report on. Examples for measures that can help to do this are, of course, transnational lists. Also, the reform of the funding and spending rules of the European political parties, especially in order to allow Euro parties to spend money in national campaigns and to be present in national politics, because this, of course, will help them to be visible and to be more present in the public debates in the mass media. Then, obviously, every strengthening of a government-opposition dynamic at the European level would be helpful for a more partisan debate. The Spitzenkandidaten are probably a good first step in this direction, but they are not enough, obviously. Bolder steps would be, for example, the election of the Commission by the European Parliament, or reform of the vote of no confidence, which would mean that the European Commission becomes more of a parliamentary government, more dependent on the majorities in the European Parliament. And finally, every extension of majority decisions in the Council, any abolition of national veto rights, and every simplification of majority rules in the Council indirectly will also mean that the majority formation in the European Parliament becomes more important for the agenda setting. So any extension of majority decisions in the European Council will indirectly also strengthen partisan political debate at the European level. And I think it is very good that through the conference on the future of Europe and through the party reform and the electoral reform that are currently discussed in the European Parliament, it now looks, I'm quite optimistic that we are going to go into this direction in the near future. So I leave it there. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuela. I think those are very important points, because indeed the fact that at the European level, as you describe it, when particularly at moments of big crisis, big opportunities for change as well, like the Euro crisis or the pandemic and now the war, is the national governments that appear as the main political actors of the Union, as opposed to the European political parties. This is a very important insight, and you propose institutional reforms that can have an effect on changing the dynamic. Of course, if we give the voter the possibility, in addition to electing members of the European Parliament, also to indicate a preference for President of the Commission, this could have a positive impact. This is why we are doing, among other things, the proposal for a new electoral law, also to give more visibility, yes, to European political parties. And then we have the question of I noted here the European political system being boring. I think that's the expression that Manuel used. And of course, the question of the dynamic between government and opposition. Of course, that also depends, I will say, of the national political experiences, because if you, and I have talked casually with friends here in Belgium, and they say, well, for us elections, is to see who changes in the coalition, but it's not really that is a radical change from one, yeah. But I'm going to give the floor to the MEPs, and then we come back to the table. I don't know who, Cyrus or Margarita, would like to take the floor. Margarita.
Thank you, Dominic. As I understood, I can speak Portuguese. Yes, it's in the list. Okay, so I'll do it. I'm sorry. Tendo em conta as últimas...
Now, I listened to Dominic's last few words there, and I would like to give you a concrete example. When the Portuguese Prime Minister in 2015 was asked whether or not, if there were to be a minority, or if we were to have a minority in the Parliament, would he be able to reach an agreement with the centre-right party, the EPP, in order to have a majority in the government. Could there be an S&D-EPP coalition? He completely rejected this solution. He rejected this solution because he believed that there needed to be an alternative for citizens. Citizens should be able to choose, by means of an election, a left-wing or centre-left government or a right-wing government or centre-right government. I think that this reaction, it's a reaction that we may not be able to understand from the point of view of the party at the time. I think it's a very politically important decision, in the sense that political parties are responsible for providing different options, different democratic options. If we are unable to provide citizens with different choices, this can lead to radicalization and an increase in support for extremes. And I think that's what led to radicalization in some countries of the EU. My second point is related to the fact that Europe's response to the crisis in 2011 created, in some countries, an anti-EU movement. Some anti-austerity protests in member states were levelled not against national governments but against the EU. Now, what's that got to do with the topic of today's event? I don't think we can say that there is no European public sphere. It exists. It exists because citizens have a relationship with the EU. But there's one key question here, and that's the role of European political families. They are responsible for shaping public opinion. Our elections allow us to put forward a European manifesto. But very often this takes a second stage to national policies. Now, can we redress this balance? Yes, we can, because we can talk directly to our citizens. We need to focus not on the fact that we are European, but we need to show how our policies can impact their lives on a national level. And I think this is important. That's why I believe that it's important for us to create transnational lists. This would be an important step forward. These transitional lists should go hand in hand with a European manifesto. We need to be able to justify the introduction of transitional lists. It's a commitment to the European model. And in order for this to succeed, we need true, solid European manifestos, which will be drafted by the political parties. And only this will create an effective European public sphere. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. I completely agree. I would add one point. That is a program or a transnational list presented by a European political party should go hand in hand with a European manifesto, but it also go hand in hand with a candidate for the President of the Commission. So, political party, manifesto, and candidate. Now I can see that Professor Guéraud has arrived. Or actually, I know that Professor Guéraud is going to have to leave, so then I will give the floor to Pierre and Mr. Stanishev.
It ties in with what Maria's just said. I, too, would like to go back to what Mr. Mueller was saying in his presentation and state that the basic assumptions under point 3 in the PowerPoints are assumptions I don't share. The core assumption is that the framing and the discussions in nation states is along party lines, and that European level it's along national lines, but that's not accurate. What we see is that at national level currently, in the meantime, there is consensus across parties on issues such as, for example, climate. During the German elections in September, none of the parties took any clear positions, apart from the fact that they're all in favor of climate. And over the past 10, 15 years in many European countries, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, there are broad coalitions because parties no longer can be distinguished one from the other. And so that this is along party lines in nation states is something that I would contest. And similarly, the framing at European level, where there are European discussions that are framed along national lines, well, that's not correct either. The French discussion is split down the middle, pro-European Macron, anti-European Le Pen, and in Austria you have the same. And surely the European discussion in each member state is completely split. And what happens is what I tried to say earlier. Now, because that split is no longer a split between government and legitimate opposition, the opposition has been pushed out, PiS, Orban, Le Pen, as opposition. They're not seen as legitimate. You know, from the point of view of law, they are accepted, but not in moral terms. So the government opposition game no longer works, and that's why now it's about protecting the system or criticizing the system. And that's true at national level and at European level. And from a political science point of view, that means we're going through civil war. And this was said, la France est dans un état de guerre civile. France is going through a civil war. And of course, Marie is right, a transnational list is the solution. We need to democratize and parliamentarize the European Union. It's only at the European level that we can have the left-right system again. It's through having transnational lists that at European level we can really have left going at it against right. And we will no longer fall into this trap of either having to defend the EU and what it stands for and how it's set up, or criticize it. And again, these basic assumptions from Mr. Mueller is something I would debunk. And the fact that these are elite discussions, well, I don't know how many people are tuning in, probably not that many, and that again is a problem. But the main point I would like to make is that today the discussions are not about left against right, it's about upper and down. Reversed totalitarianism is what we call it. There's a system of liberal Democrat elites that have the power. They have a discourse. You have to think this way about COVID, that way about Ukraine. When it comes to climate, you have to think this, that, or the other. And that discourse is what creates in social stratas a pro-liberal democracy middle ground, and basically all the others are being pushed to the outside. And rather than saying, well, you're part of a public space and public sphere and discussing with you, we're pushing you to the outside.
Thank you. Dankeschön, Ulrike. But before moving to the next panel, we still have some time. I don't know, Maria, Joao, Stanis, Sergei, you just arrived, and you will speak. Pierre, you would like to add something?
This is a very interesting discussion. As a representative of the French presidency of the Council, it's hard to take a position on all of these points. It's an in-depth political analysis and the evolution of political movements on a European level, on a French level. it's going to be hard for me to tread that line. I'm sorry, I don't think I can actually come back on those points. Perhaps you could say anything. Do you have anything you want to add to your initial intervention? If not, Maria Joao.
Would you like to add something in this first part of the debate without preempting what you will tell us in the next one?
Concerned because I'm supposed to speak, so I don't want to preempt what I am supposed to say. Nevertheless, I think the interventions made by the three speakers are very interesting to understand what is happening right now and what might happen over the next period. From my viewpoint, building on my own experience, including in this house, I do think there is a frame which remains relevant to understand the political life in Europe, which is, yes, we have very different positions, but we need to identify clearly those who are pro-European positions and those who are not pro-European positions, and then inside the pro-European positions, I think there is a clear difference between right and left. And of course, when we enter in this house, we get the feeling this is extremely complex and we cannot see these differences. But I can assure that when we are really dealing with the parliamentary report and building the majorities we need to have to pass the report, we feel this like hell, because it's member by member. We need to build a majority where we go through, we create a pro-European camp, and then inside this one, we have the left and right, and of course the Social Democrats try to lead, and many times they can make it. Of course, seen from the outside of the Parliament, this is very complex. This is even more complex in the Council, because in the Council there is a big fog about lack of information and a kind of a very soft way to make the political differences. But, well, I'm speaking here in front of the President of the European Party, and as I will say in my intervention, the role of political families today is much more important than the one perceived from the outside. Because we cannot forget that before each important decision inside the European Parliament, inside a Council meeting, inside the European Council, now there are informal meetings organized by political family. I'm not saying this is marvelous and perfect, but what I'm saying is this is quite different from the situation we had, I can tell you, even 10 years ago. The role of political families is much more important than perceived. But that said, it is true, when we go to the national level, this is not understood because the role of the European political family is not visible at national level, in the national debates, in the national campaigns. So we miss instruments regarding media work, but also regarding the way European parties should be perceived as a kind of multi-level organization, where when we go to elections at national level, and particularly European elections, absolutely we need to give much more visibility to the European political families. And that's why a report as the one you are preparing is so important. Because as Margarita is saying, we need to have a clear connection between our debate here and the debate at national level. And as Iracho was saying, we know that European policies today is about national policies. The connection is completely direct, but this is not perceived like that by citizens. So there is something wrong about this. Second point I'd like to make is about Ulrike's call, a very strong one, by the simple and strong idea of equality among citizens. Because she's right. If we go to the French concept of nation, Nation is a group of people who want to deal together, first of all, on their social issues. It's about social solidarity. This is the root of a nation. Now, what is at stake is to build up this identity, this common identity at European scale. And I do believe that European Pillar of Social Rights is a very interesting step in this direction. But we are at the beginning of this construction. So let's see what comes from the Conference on the Future of Europe, because the aspiration is there. Citizens want to have equal rights about the basic things. And this, I agree with Ulrike, this is a very powerful, simple political idea. And for me, it should be the central idea of the next phase of the European project. Is how can we make this real? Because this is not real yet. So this is my comment.
Thank you, Maria Joao. I don't know, Manuel, if you want to add something, because Ulrike also referred to your presentation.
Ja, sehr gerne. Ich werde das.
Yes, it would be a pleasure. I'll do it in German, because I can hear German has been spoken. I think there were certain misunderstandings about the European approach to public debate, and the fact that all national media has the same stance. Of course, on a national level as well, there is a split between media who support the government, others who find it bad, who support the EU, find it bad. Now, there is a split which can be found on a national level in political discourse as well, which points are put forward for discussion. For example, in France, you can see that there are people who believe that Macron's position is a good one on Europe, others believe who completely reject his approach to Europe, and at the least there is a discussion on Macron's position. In Germany, Macron's stance in public is very rarely discussed. And this is why I think that the European public sphere is split or very different in different countries. And it's rare nowadays that you have unity between media sources across Europe. There tends to be a fragmentation. So looking at national democracies, whether it is whether parties are at the fore, or whether there is a criticism of political parties or of the system as a whole, I think that parties who are critical of the system tend to work together with media that is critical of the system. So at the end of the day, we end up with parties which are labeled as anti-democratic, those who are criticizing the system itself. But we do have a choice between parties who wish to impact the system as a whole. Now, the problem here, whether you're defending the system or attacking the system, whether this can be healthy for a democracy, well, I completely agree with what was said. I think this is a fundamental reason for this, is that we only look at this issue on a national level at the moment, but there are a lot of questions which are no longer decided on a national level. There are cross-border issues where we need to provide European or indeed global answers. And when these big questions are being tackled on an EU level, they're discussed along party political lines. Because of our political systems, there is an ongoing attempt to reach consensus, to build a coalition. This means that it's hard to reach decisions unless you can reach a consensus or coalition between the EPP and the S&D, or indeed the Liberals, or perhaps even bringing further political parties on board who would never have a majority themselves. So this constant search for a coalition or consensus-oriented political system could lead to problems further down the line and lead to stronger party political conflict. I don't want to end up with a system on a European level where the team is completely changed, as it were, the representatives completely changed. I don't want to completely substitute our political systems, but if you have a system like in Germany, Belgium, or Finland, where parties do chop and change quite a bit, this is never going to be the case in the European system, because we have this large coalition in the middle, which will continue in power, as it were, because that is how the system is built, and no alternative will be possible as long as the system is based on the search for a coalition. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Manuel. It's complicated. No? Maybe you want to say something now? Last chance.
Alors, à titre personnel plus qu'à...
Well, I'll put it on a personal note rather than in line with the Council. I'm not entirely in line with this dichotomy between a national debate and the European debate. I mean, the lack of opposition at European level compared to the national level. Well, look at France, for example. In France, we have an absolute majority system, which makes a clear distinction between the government and the majority on the one hand and the opposition on the other. And there are other countries where there are proportional systems which work with coalitions, and they're much more similar to the situation in the European Parliament. I don't know if that's the only explanation, but there's also a lack of interest in the media for European subjects, a lack of visibility for the European subjects at the national level. So I think there is a need for Europeanization of elections and national debates. I think that's something that we would share in the French presidency. I think we would share that diagnosis. So that's why we're trying to work through some of the texts on the table, like the rules on European political parties, that we try to ensure that political parties have more room for manoeuvre, to act, to directly finance events, for example, when it is a subject that is linked to European politics. So there could be a possibility to co-finance events directly. As the Council and as a member state, we can incite those kind of initiatives. For example, on the European political parties, that there are national political parties that are aware and make an effort. For example, when it comes to logos, that they put the European political party logo when they have advertising, for example, or on posters. I'm sure you're favourable to that in the European Parliament, but it is something that does already exist, but is not really respected in practice. There are quite a lot of similar issues where something exists in practice. You might want to move further, but you can actually build upon rules that already exist. I think there are ways to make this easier. I think the transnational lists is something that in France we see as something that would really help to make the debate more European. I think it's undeniable. If you look at the development of the political debate, the lack of opposition, the centralization of the debate, well, I can assure you that there's enough debate at the European level. I don't think that there's a lack of opposition, as I would see it.
Yes, I completely agree with your assessment. It's clear that European democracy... Yes, I was just saying I agree with Pierre's assessment of the situation. European democracy will be a collaborative democracy for many years to come, collaborative between different approaches, but that doesn't mean we can't change some of the elements that make up the structure, such as transnational lists, having a program, electoral program, which is negotiated on the basis of the manifestos which were submitted before the elections. So there's an awful lot that can be done to increase the democratic nature of our system without doing away with it altogether. I'd also like to pick up on what Pierre said, and this is something which Gabi Bischoff said at the beginning. National parties tend not to be very generous when it comes to discussing work done by the European parties, but nothing stops my party, for example. I hope that nobody in Madrid is listening to me now, but nothing would stop the PSOE from using the PES logo on their publicity material. I mean, they could do this, but to date they've never done it. I know that some of us who are closest to the Secretariat for European Affairs, we've tried to push it, but perhaps not for the national elections. But why wouldn't they put the logo of the PES on the PSOE electoral material? I mean, the Fistol in a Rose. I mean, why not? There's no reason not to do that. I'd like to ask you now to take the floor to present the rest of the panel. We've got Sergei Stanishev, we've got Samuel Hicks, who I think is connected online, and then Maria Joao Rodriguez is here. So Cyrus, perhaps you could take the seat here on the top table.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to the first panel, which was a very interesting panel to discuss the role and the emerging European public space. But now we're going to move on to the next panel, which will be discussing the future of European democracy and the role of European parties. And let me introduce our speakers today. We have 3 speakers in this panel. First, our dear colleague here in the European Parliament, Sergei Stanishev, who is not only an excellent member of the European Parliament and head of the Bulgarian SND delegation, but is also the president of the Party of European Socialists. Our second speaker of this panel is Professor Simon Hicks, who's a professor at the European University Institute in Florence. He is known for his publications on the political system of the European Union and other publications on political parties, electoral law, and Brexit, among others, which I have had the pleasure of studying in my university years. And last but not least, Maria Joao Rodriguez will speak as president of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, Feps, and she is also one of our former colleagues here in the European Parliament. Feps has contributed, among others, to the Conference on the Future of Europe with the book Our European Future, and I'm sure that we will also discuss this publication in our discussion today. So firstly, I'll give the floor to our PS President, Sergei Stanishev.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, let me first start with a follow-up to the end of the previous panel and discussion, which I caught to a certain extent because I came in quite late. But I think we have a very serious problem of communication with the citizens, because by default European democracy is having more consensual character. And Maria Joao is right that within the pro-European majority in the European Parliament, there is a clear distinction between policies for which our family is standing, EPP is quite different, Renew, etc. But to the citizens, it looks like all the same. It's not so clear distinction because in comparison to the national democracies, which are based both in majoritarily ruled democracies or in proportional systems, on some kind of a clear majority and distinction between government and opposition, it doesn't really work that way at the European level. At least it's hidden, more in the shadows. Plus the intergovernmental character of the European Union as an organization, where more or less, and I've been in that role, every prime minister coming from the council is explaining not what his family gained as a political decision of the council, but what did he or she defend as national interest facing Brussels, more or less, and the other groups of countries. So this makes the task for European political parties much more difficult because they are much less visible and much less understandable for the citizens at the national level. As we all know, news from Brussels usually are not on the front line of the national media, and communication is making it more difficult. Now, the second thing is, of course, which is the most powerful tool and distinction which helps the European political parties being visible. It's European elections, clearly. And I'm very proud that, of course, our family initiated back in 2014 the first attempt with the Spitzenkandidat, and then continued it in 2019. Because I can say that especially in 2019, it was a huge success. Because we learned from some experiences of the previous elections, and we managed to make this campaign in a very effective way. So in the end, I'm not saying that this is due only to our effort and to the structure and character of our campaign and our candidate, Frans Timmermans, but it worked, it played a role. We had, for the first time in many years, not decrease, but a substantial increase in the numbers of people, European citizens, who participated in European elections. From 43% to 51, 52 even, which is very visible and substantial. Plus, we achieved two very important tasks. First, all the predictions that the anti-European parties will be very powerful, they failed. As well as the prognosis, which were very widespread, even in our family, not to mention the pollsters and analysts, that our family will be third or maybe fourth in the ranking of political forces. I can speak very much in length how that was achieved for our family. There's both contributions of the national parties, but also the character of the European campaign and the approach which we had towards it, but it worked. Now, the big problem with this is that this game of the Spitzen, I'm now speaking game in a positive way, of the Spitzencandidate, it was launched and played a role twice, and both times it didn't work. Exactly, at least the way how we were seeing, especially in the second time. Because if the first time it was clear that, okay, Juncker came first, he got the presidency of the Commission, and our candidate became the president of the Parliament. The second time, we had a very clear political message before. It's not just who comes first in the polls, it's who can form a majority in the European Parliament. And we had a very strong stance, and the group is well aware of it, that actually Manfred Weber didn't have the majority in the parliament, so a chance should be given to Frans Timmermans, who had very, very good chances in the parliament, and also even in the council at a certain moment. But we didn't succeed with this. And our family swallowed this reality, which makes a third attempt very problematic. And I think this is a very serious risk for European democracy in general, for the next 2024 European elections. Because if you don't have this powerful incentive, mobilizing people saying, you will decide, you will play a role, then we may face again a reverse in the democratic participation of citizens in European elections and undermine legitimacy of the European institutions, because after all, the only democratically elected European institution in the end is the European Parliament. Yes, of course, we know that the Commission is also selected and voted by the Parliament, but we know that the process is quite different, not so directly democratic. So we have a big challenge, I would say now, in how do we treat this issue. And of course, only if we provide, and I'm speaking not only about the Parliament, which I'm sure will do through its voting on the regulations on the political parties and the way how we conduct the next elections, there will be a clear political will, quite powerful, and Dominic is very well aware because he was a rapporteur on this, giving a clear signal about the role which Spitzenkandidat should play, about the transnational lists and everything else, but then we'll come to the Council. And if the Council kills all these initiatives, we'll be back facing the same political problem. And this is a question to which, for the moment, we still don't have our response. How do we react to this and how we compensate it and how we mobilize people? Because we cannot say, look, guys, we failed twice, but it's not our fault, let's try again. It may not work with a very high probability. So this is one problem I would like to identify. And then comes the third element, which is a very broad one. Of course, the work of the European political parties is not excluded to the European election, not limited to the European elections. There are many, many more elements. One of them, for sure, is the work of the pre-councils. By the way, there is a very good research with a lot of graphs provided by the European Parliamentary Research Service with a very clear indication how these political pre-councils of the different families have been working in the last many years, actually, from the early years of the 21st century until now, and there is a clear increase of the number of these pre-councils, and especially it's very sharp with the PS family. And also the content. We managed through our communication, however humble it may be in comparison to the national media, but at least in the Brussels bubble and in the Brussels media, to be present very clearly with the social agenda, with our identity. And I think this work is quite successful for the family, because I remember at a period of time when I was just elected as president of PS and the prime ministers were not coming. So we tried to analyze why is it the case. And there were very simple practical reasons. Because we had the formula to invite everybody. The prime ministers, the leaders of the parties in opposition, our commissioners, our committee of regions, everybody representing and being important for our family. Indeed, they are. But when you have 1 hour and a half maximum, and you have so many people and speakers, then inevitably everybody speaks on her or his agenda, which may not coincide with the subject of the council. And this made it not very effective for the prime ministers, and many of them just skipping this time, trying to use them for bilateral meetings or any other purposes. So we were forced, in order to make it effective, reduce the composition, to give more space to the prime ministers to discuss informally, directly, without, leaking or without media, the problems in detail, and to explain each other's position and to try to form, sometimes successfully, sometimes not completely, but a family position. And I think it is a very positive experience. Plus the many other forms of our political work, and it's the Ministerial Networks, the different topical networks of the PES, which are chaired by our high-level representatives, which are developing policies, which are then approved either by the presidency or at a higher level by council or the leaders' conference or the Congress of the PES. And I think this is all positive. And the other important element of our work is, of course, the contacts with our parties. I have always been in line that in the end, our families will be strong only if we are somehow helpful and useful to our member parties to win national elections. Because this is where they come, facing the voters, and they gain votes or not. So I think we achieved and made a lot of novelties in our approach in order to be practically helpful to the member parties in their political campaigns and in their electoral campaigns. Last but not least, and I'm tempted to speak on this because yesterday I was in a very interesting presentation of a book by our colleague in the European Parliament, Jonas Fernandes from PSOE, who made an effort and made a very interesting, challenging books about social democracy coming back to its roots, to its identity in many ways, being social, fighting for social rights of the working people, etc. But there is also a special chapter on PES, where he solidly shares a number of ideas which are logical and very interesting, but the problem is the following, and I shared it yesterday when I received a question on this, that the level of internal integration of PES and the level and the way how we are organized to work is very different from the one of national parties. You cannot mechanically apply the experience from national parties to the PES because, again, it reflects the political will and vision of the member parties as a whole. There are member parties which are strongly federalists and want a PES much more centralized, I would say. But there is another group which is much more skeptical about any further moves in this direction. So what we have, as it is with the European Union, is the reflection of the general consensual will of our family. And I gave the example with the Constitution for Europe of 2004. Brilliant document, in my understanding, produced by committed Europeans, adopted and creating very high expectations. But then it failed to bring the support of the voters into a referendum in France and in the Netherlands. And although it would be now very useful with the new challenges which we are facing as European Union and also as a political family, to have it at our disposal, but we have the Lisbon Treaty, which is much weaker, a compromise again, with which we have to work. And I'm finishing with the following. It doesn't mean that we cannot achieve results. You have to be patient, focused, and well coordinated in order to achieve it. And I will give the example of how we as a family treated the last crisis, which started with the COVID. From day one, our family, first we managed to reorganize ourselves very clearly in the way how we work, to move from physical meetings to online meetings, etc., but to produce a very clear political message. With this crisis, we have to tackle it in a different way than 2008 and 2009. We need to avoid another austerity exercise. We need apart from the sanitary health measures, protecting people for their health, vaccination, etc., we need a powerful recovery plan. Big scale, huge one, with new instruments. That was the general consensus. And although there were many differences in our family at the beginning, not to mention that the word Eurobonds, or even the hint going towards some instrument reminding of Eurobonds, was a taboo for some member parties, in the end, life changed this attitude, and we managed to have, a common debt, which is guaranteed by the whole of the European Union, which provides the tool to help the country recover, and to a very high extent bringing a progressive agenda, a socially protective agenda, and agenda for modernization of the European economy, which is, I think, our political victory. And we should be proud of this. But of course, we need to work much more on communication and also on the content and the forms of our work. But it should be a collective effort with a common political will. It doesn't mean that we have to stick to the lowest common denomination. We'd never do. But we have to push forwards step by step. This is the realistic picture which I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei. It's obviously very interesting to also see the way that the increased turnout in the 2019 European election, whether it is a reflection of an increased Europeanization of those elections or not. Definitely something that is really coming out is the importance of more communications and more visibility of the European political parties in our different member states, and the way that a change in the way that we should start electing the European Commission as a parliament. But finally, it is all a question of Europeanization, as Pierre had said earlier on, a Europeanization of our European elections, Europeanization of our national parties. But I think if we think about it as well, maybe Europeanization of the European Union itself and the way it functions and its decision-making process. But anyway, from a very hands-on experience of Sergei, we'll move on now to a more academic approach from Professor Simon Hicks from the European University Institute in Florence. The floor is yours. I believe you're connected.
Thank you. Can somebody turn on my camera?
So we can hear you. Can someone turn on Professor Hicks's camera?
Sir, you should go on the bottom settings on the top left of the page. From there you can find the bottom camera.
We now see you.
Thank you very much. Can you put up my slides from my talk? Thank you very much. Let me say a few words first. It's a great pleasure to be back, if you like, back in the European Parliament. I was a PhD student here at the EUI in 1992 to 95, and I actually wrote my PhD on the party leaders' summits ahead of the EU summits. So it's great to see the emergence of these political councils ahead of the EU summits, and it's something that really began in the early 1990s. Since then, I've been, in my research and teaching, working on parties and democracy in the EU, so 25 years. It's great to be back on the continent and out of Brexit Britain. I am a very committed pro-European, as I'm sure, if you know my work, you're well aware, and I worked for the Socialist Group in the European Parliament. So I wish I could be there with you. I'm sorry I can't. I had to teach here in Florence, but I would love to be there in the future. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is building on some of my own thoughts from these many years of teaching and researching EU politics, and also the Socialist Group and the rise and the fall of social democracy over the last 100 years. And it touches on a lot of the things that have been said by previous speakers. So could you show the next slide, please? But first of all, let me say, what are we talking about here? We're talking about European political parties. We all think, and we all agree with a famous Schatzschneider quote from 1942 in his book Party Government, where he says, democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. And why do we think that? Well, we think parties play a critical role in several senses in national democracy, and we'd like to think they play a similarly critical role in building European democracy in terms of selecting and choosing candidates for political office, and particularly executive office, reducing the complexity of politics down to the set of issues that at any one time we think is really important, and setting out clear and coherent positions and trade-offs across those issues, and what we call manifestos. And of course, we've seen the European parties develop their own manifestos. And then there's a third element, which is parties play a key role in elections in mobilizing and engaging citizens and getting them, in a sense, to participate in providing incentives for them to get engaged in politics. And through this process, this is actually the vehicle. Parties are the critical vehicle through which we're able to connect the choice that voters make in the ballot box through to who actually becomes the head of government or the leaders of the executive, through eventually then to policy outcomes. And in the European context, you can see that the parties play that key role, or we'd like them to play that key role. Electoral choice. We'd like political parties in Europe to provide a choice of different policy agendas, to provide a choice for executive office. And this is where I think the Spitzenkandidat process, at least in my mind, is really critical in trying to build European democracy, through to then connecting the kind of promises that we make and the promises the Spitzenkandidat make in their campaigns through to eventually what the EU does in terms of policy outcomes. And I think that, we can talk about the European Parliament elections, and I'll say a little bit about that, but I really do think, and I want to emphasize it again, that the battle for executive office is really critical. I've always thought that's critical. Increasingly in a world where we've seen a declining membership of political parties, declining identification with political parties. So in general, voters are not so attached to political parties in European democracies as they were 20, let alone 30 or 40 years ago. However, we do see voters, and particularly younger voters, very engaged in politics, very engaged in the kind of the contest of politics or the competition of politics. And so we need to think about how do we provide more of a vehicle through which we can engage citizens and engage younger citizens in that choice of who they want to govern them, and engaged in that process, if you like, the drama of politics. And what I was hoping and what I would like to see is the Spitzenkandidat process providing a vehicle through which we can create more of a political drama of politics, which will engage a lot of younger people in the political process. So next slide, please. But of course, what is fascinating from a political science point of view is we've seen parties emerge at the European level without there being this very strong electoral connection. This shouldn't have happened. We normally have theories of parties that say they emerge because there are elections. In fact, that's not what has happened. At the European level, parties have emerged in the European Parliament, if you like, as legislative actors, as policy actors, and they've coalesced along ideological lines, as you all know, around the famille spirituelle. Ironically, the more powers the European Parliament has got, the more powerful the parties have become. A lot of people thought the opposite would happen. A lot of people thought you'd increase the power of the European Parliament and the parties would break down because national interests would take over. In fact, the opposite has happened, and there's a good reason for that, which is most of the battles in European politics, in EU politics, in the European Parliament, actually divide a lot of people along political party lines, particularly when it comes to, say, regulation of the single market, higher environment standards, social standards, regulation of the market, even economic and monetary union, perhaps not on some issues like foreign policy. So we've seen increasingly arguments or lineups or the creation of parties in the European Parliament largely along left-right lines. Next slide, please. And in fact, if you look at voting in the European Parliament, so here's my sort of most recent map of voting in the Parliament. Every dot here is an MEP. The distances between the dots show the distances in the voting patterns of these MEPs, and you can clearly see the political groups in the European Parliament. So I think the key challenge we have in trying to build party democracy in Europe is how do we connect what voters do in European Parliament elections to that map in the European Parliament and the choice then for the executive office of the Spitzenkandidat. If we can figure that out, I think we've solved a lot of the democratic deficit, a lot of the problems and challenges facing European democracy and building European democracy. Next slide, please. The problem, of course, is that this classic electoral connection is missing. if you go back and read, and I get my students to do this, what people wrote in the late 70s when European Parliament elections were first introduced in 1979, people were making claims like, we will have pan-European parties, we will have pan-European democracy, voters will be making choices to choose about the direction of the policy agenda of the then European communities. That didn't happen. In fact, European Parliament elections have been disappointing in some senses they have failed to create that electoral connection that we hope that they would create. And in fact, if you go back, there's a great book on those first European Parliament elections by Karl-Heinz Reif and Hermann Schmidt, where they came up with this notion, second-order national elections, which is to say, these are not actually first-order elections, and they're not European elections. They're second-order elections, and they are national elections, fought by national political parties on national political agendas about national political leaders. And we have not managed to break that national party control, that national party dominance of these elections. So national parties fight these elections on the record of national government, and it's a chance for voters to protest against national governments, hence opposition parties do better than governing parties. It's a chance for voters to go and vote for smaller parties rather than larger parties. And it's very, very hard to find evidence that Europe really has played a big part, or Europe really matters in those elections. And this is still something I think we're facing a big challenge for, and I think we need to think creatively about how we break this. And this is why I'm a little bit skeptical about some of the claims people make about these pan or transnational lists. I'm in favour of transnational lists, don't get me wrong. I think it's a great innovation. I think we'll be pushing in the right direction. But I don't have confidence that they will really be transformative in what we need to try and create this electoral connection. Next slide, please. And this is why I was very optimistic about the Spitzenkandidat process. I mean, I wrote a book called What's Wrong with Europe and How to Fix It, and I was arguing for Spitzenkandidat, and I was one of many people arguing, of course, for this. And the 2014 elections, we can say, on the one hand, you know, we've had 2 rounds of these elections, as President Stanishev was discussing. You could argue that they failed. Neither really in 2014 or 2019 did we see a major change, transformation from the second-order dynamic that I just described. We didn't see a single ALDE candidate or Renew candidate, if you like, in 2019. And then in 2019, the heads of government, if you like, abandoned, or the narrative was that they abandoned or overturned the Spitzenkandidat process. And there's a real danger that the process could actually die in 2024. On the other side, I would say, you know, the glass is half full. There was evidence of higher turnout in 2014 and 2019 in the member states where there were candidates from and where debates were held. And in fact, you can see, in fact, what people call a Timmermans effect in the Netherlands, particularly the significant increase in votes for the PvdA in the Netherlands because Timmermans was a very high-profile candidate in that country. So there's some elements of the campaign did start to shift, and I think we could think about, we need candidates from other parts of Europe, we need to organise debates in many more member states, we need to try and think about ways to reach down into the democratic debate in many more countries in the Spitzenkandidat process. Also, you can argue that the heads of government still felt compelled to choose a candidate from EPP, because that was the group that emerged as the largest group, and still felt compelled to recognise the mandates that had been created for Timmermans and for Vestager, who emerged, in a sense, as the lead candidate from ALDE, even though they didn't really have one. So it's not quite completely empty. Glass is still partly full, and I think we could still be pushing further on that side, and that's what I'd like to see European political parties thinking creatively about. Next slide, please. So then how would we make the Spitzenkandidat process work better? And here, for me, it's largely about trying to think about how to break that control of the election process by national political parties, at least partially. I know you're all members of national political parties and you're chosen by national political parties and you're if you say, agents of national political parties, but national political parties are in a sense holding back the possibility of creating really pan-European party democracy. And this is what I liked that the Greens had, the innovation of the open primary, that really allowed and engaged directly individual citizens to get directly involved in choosing candidates. I'd like to see an app, an S&D app for the elections that allows citizens to register to vote, to choose, or at least play a role in choosing or having a voice in the process of choosing. Perhaps the process could be shifted closer to the elections, so you can perhaps have higher profile candidates who are willing to put their name forward. Of course, a tension between having an open primary and having it close to the elections. I'd like to see, as I said, more candidate debates, perhaps an internal primary debate in different member states, in different countries across Europe, to create more of a sense of contest, a sense of drama in this choice. It was interesting, there was actually more coverage of the debate between Alexander Stubb and Manfred Weber in the EPP than there was in some countries, the debate of actually the Spitzenkandidat process itself. I'd even say it's worth thinking about the possibility of changing some of the narrative around the contest. I think maybe a broader progressive alliance of politicians, perhaps S&D, Greens, some other groups, to think, could there be a broader kind of contest that really shakes things up at the European level and creates some drama, some political narratives that start to shift at the European level? Final slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So, regarding the party statute, and of course, this is my sort of wish list that probably won't happen. And I know the statute is going to focus on funding, and the statute is going to focus on some good things like allowing European parties to actually spend money in national arenas. And I think I'm not saying I'm not opposed to that. I'm saying these are good things, but I don't think they would necessarily be fundamental in shifting the sort of equilibrium that we're locked into, which is this second order effect in European Parliament elections. I would actually require European parties to put forward at least one lead candidate by a certain date. This would lock parties into committing them to the Spitzenkandidat process. And then I would require parties to have a democratic process for choosing that candidate. Of course, they can decide how they do that, but if you write it into a statute, it forces parties to think, how do we do that? I would even require parties to pre-commit to debates between those candidates, and I would require parties to actually allow direct membership. I know this is very politically explosive amongst some national political parties. They want the European parties to be federations of national political parties. I actually think it's really important that we increasingly provide mechanisms for individual citizens, particularly younger citizens, to re-engage in politics. Very, very few young people are members of political parties, but they might want to think about being members with, or some kind of direct membership or direct affiliation with, European political parties. And the more young people we can get engaged in that political debate, it's the next generation that I care about most. So that's all I've got for you. I wanted to try and keep it brief so we can open it up to a much more open discussion and debate about these things. But let me thank again for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, and I wish I really was there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hicks. It's obviously very interesting to hear of your wish list, which is a number of very interesting proposals that I'm sure not only us as S&D and our political party, PES, but other political parties at European level could also consider for the upcoming 2024 European elections. You mentioned that there should be a candidate named by a certain date, and I think that is one of the most important issues that we also need to consider. When should we start the actual campaigning for the next European elections, and would that increase the turnout in the elections themselves? But now we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Maria Joao Rodrigues, President of Feps. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be in such a panel with an important topic and accompanied by the President of our European Party and also Professor Simon Hicks, a recognized expert on these issues. Look, let me come with my insights about this topic. First of all, it's relevant to underline that European political parties are a moving reality. And we had been through important developments over the last years. When we compare which was exactly a European political party now, and it was 10 years or 15 years ago, we can see a huge difference. If I refer particularly the PES, when the President just referred this, we could have important developments to build up a real European political party. Because beyond the basic bodies, such as a presidency, a leaders' meeting, the European political party, the Social Democrats, is now able to be influential in many other fronts regarding European institutions themselves. So, of course, the European Parliament, it goes by saying, because we do have parliamentarian groups, but we have the Council with pre-Council meetings. We have European Council with a pre-European Council meeting. For the reasons the President explained, this starts gaining traction, because I remember some years ago it was not easy to make the ministers come to these meetings. Now they come. They come because they feel these meetings are extremely useful for their work once they go to the meeting of the Council. This is really a new reality of a European political party. The second one was underlined by the President, is the joint work with national parties, particularly in the moments of national elections. So this is really something we need to have in view when we discuss the implications. Now, let me come with 3 points. Why we need European political parties, what kind of political parties we should have, and how can we go further. Why we need? Well, let me just start by saying that against many opinions we can now find saying we don't need political parties, this is really something which is outdated. And from my viewpoint, this is wrong, because ultimately, what is a political party? Political party is a group of citizens who decide to organize themselves to offer choices of political action and to offer possible names for elected posts on an accountable way. So if we take into account this simple definition about what is a political party, for me it's obvious that we do need, this is really the basic infrastructure of democracy. And if we need this at national level, we also need this at European level. This is what's happening now. Now, why we need them more precisely? Well, we need them to deal with the many issues we are confronted with day by day, where we need to have political decision. But I'd like to focus on the big moments of political choice. And my other colleagues of the panel, they underline the big moment, which is European elections. I do believe that we could create an important innovation, which is to come with the Spitzenkandidaten, and so meaning to give a say, indirect say, to citizens, to influence the choice of the President of the European Commission. From my viewpoint, we should build on this experience and see how we can move further. We need to assess exactly what happened in 2014 and then 2014, because the reasons why this instrument was not completely successful, they are different. In 2014, we got, let's say, a risk of failure because the European Council was resisting to a candidate which was clearly backed by not only European elections, but by a majority in the European Parliament. And then we had a final forcing and making it possible for the European Parliament to get the candidate being supported. And this was, let's say, a kind of victory of the European Parliament regarding the traditional European Council resistance. So I would say this was half a victory from this viewpoint. In the second moment, where, as Sergei Stanishev was saying, we could run a very successful campaign and to give more visibility to the Spitzenkandidaten, I think the problem came afterwards, when, after European elections, there was no clear, sound majority inside the European Parliament to back this candidate. And this gave an opportunity to the European Council to come with another solution, This moment of lack of majority, lack of unity inside the European Parliament was used by the European Council to come up with other names. And from my viewpoint, we need to learn the lessons from these two moments and try to improve the method for the next phase, in such a way that the European Council should in fact respect the outcome of the European elections and in fact respect the outcome of the internal negotiation of the European Parliament to bring about a new majority. I think this is something we should fight for the next phase. That said, I saw, for instance, Simon Hicks referring to the possibilities to build up coalitions before elections to prepare this moment. On this, I must say that I have some doubts. I don't think we have good conditions to build up coalitions before elections, exactly because European political parties are still not visible enough to afford to go coalitions before elections. They will probably need to go one by one, but then they need to be effective in coming up with a coalition after elections. This is my assessment of the situation. Second point, what kind of parties do we need? Well, it's very interesting to see that even if the European parties have gone through a remarkable work of construction, building up, with many new developments, they are one of the institutions where it's more difficult to Europeanize, to create a European dimension. I'll just give an example. While in the European Parliament, we vote by majority. While in the Council, we vote for qualified majority voting in many issues, and we are keeping unanimity for other issues. Inside European political parties, it's very difficult to vote without a consensus. So consensus is the basic rule. So this is one of the translations of this difficulty to build up a real European dimension in the political parties. And sometimes, yes, they still behave more like a confederal construction. On the other hand, I do believe that European political parties should be conceived as a multi-level construction, with the European level and the national level, which should remain very important. And that's why I have some doubts, frankly, about this idea of direct membership to the European parties. Because let me be a bit provocative. From my viewpoint, it will be much more promising to assume that the members of the national parties are, by definition, members of the European Parliament, and they should be involved to act as such. So there is a lot of work to be done in this direction, because most of the members of the national parties are not really involved in the discussion of the European level, and they should. So this, for me, is the more promising approach. Not easy, but for me, it would be more promising. On the other hand, this is true that all parties, national, European, they should be opened up to citizens' participation, so they can invent new ways of involving citizens. And primaries are a possible example. Last point I cannot prevent myself to refer is the need of women's participation, because in the last elections, European elections, we had some novelties about this, but I must say that our party was somehow lagging behind this, and we need to go further in these real equal opportunities, men and women, in our political life. Last point, how can we move forward? Well, I think the two reports being prepared by the two MEPs, Dominic Revez and Gabi Bischoff, are important milestones. If they are approved, not only in the Parliament, but then let's see in the Council, because they will strengthen the role of European parties, and also because they will create higher visibility in European elections with the transnational lists and the possibility to identify a spirited candidate. These are building blocks of a real European democracy. But I'm concluding by saying, because right now we are also closing this conference on the future of Europe. Look, I would like to be precise. Also because I was part of the team making the final negotiation of the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty has an important potential which is still unused. And Sergei Stanishev just gave you an example of something we could invent to deal with the pandemics and the recovery, which was considered impossible. It was made possible. So this shows there is a room of maneuver. Nevertheless, I do believe that we can identify precisely some target changes in the treaty supporting our priorities, because there are also limits in the treaty. And regarding the issue we are discussing now, how far can European political parties influence the choice of the elected representatives of citizens for the European Parliament, but also influence the choice of the executive power via the European Commission? I believe that a target change in the treaty, creating a situation whereby the European Council should really accept the outcomes of the elections and the majority emerging in the European Parliament, will be an important improvement for European democracy. Because I do believe that we are moving to a new phase of the European project where citizenship and direct representation of citizens should have a stronger role. We know there is a second pillar of political legitimacy in the European Union. This is about member states, national governments. We know this will go on, but we need to have a certain rebalancing and giving a stronger role to European citizens with visible choices. So I see a limit of the Lisbon Treaty, and that's why on this particular point, and perhaps on others, I do think we need to have target changes. This is my position.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to the three different speakers that we had. It was very interesting to see the different opinions, some of them very similar to each other, on some other points maybe contradicting each other, but at the end of the day, I once again say that the issue remains the Europeanization of the whole process, which I think this is the common thing that each and every speaker has, not only in the second panel, but also in the first panel, has targeted on and spoken about. So I now open the floor to any debate, questions and answers from, I'm already seeing a number of hands rising, even from those who are maybe connected to us through the internet. So I'll start by Ulrike first.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Maria and for a perfect presentation, and Simon Hicks, and I just want to underscore the paradigm change, which is in what Maria said. We were talking 70 years about European integration, and integration is done by states. So the states are the actors. Now we talk about European democracy, and in a democracy, the citizens are the actors. So there's a double paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is from states to citizens and from integration to democracy. And it's very, very important to change the wording, because if you say democracy, citizens are addressed. If you say integration, European integration, states are addressed. And so this, I think, is overarchingly important, and many thanks to Maria for pointing this out again. Just one thing to the presentation of Simon Hicks, because I think there is the same reality in what Simon wanted to say us. Because I looked precisely at his footnote when he said we want to have the transnational list and we get these European parties, but then there is note. I'm not convinced that there's a transformative power if we get the European parties. Yeah, that's what Simon says. And again, I think it refers to the fact that you can have a party system, whatever you want to have, and you have European parties, national parties, and all the games he has been pointing to. But the essential is, if we talk elections, because we talk transnational list, the group of people who votes in these elections must vote on equal footing. And again, it points to what Maria has been saying, equal rights for equal citizens. You can change the party system as you want. If you do not give the citizens of that party system equal rights, it will not have the transformative power, and I think this is a footnote that Simon gave us.
Thank you. I move on to Pierre.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with what has just been said on the fact that talking about democracy is also involving the citizens more directly in the process. And on this aspect, I would say that according to me, and I would say to the Council also, we think that to strengthen also the European political parties and the European political parties' visibility and action in the member states, that's also one of the reasons why we are in favor of having this direct individual membership for citizens, because if you stick to national parties being member of the European Party, you're still integrating national sphere and not giving direct access to citizens to the European political party directly. And I think that in terms of, say, visibility and also actions of the European political party, it's quite interesting what Professor Hicks said on the fact that in the last 20 years, political parties have become very powerful actors here in Brussels regarding the legislative process, but at the same time, I would say without gaining any kind of visibility or strengthening their position in the member states. And that's one thing we went through when discussing the political party regulation recast in the Council a few months ago. We acknowledged the fact that in the last 20 years, the budget of the European political parties has almost doubled. But when you look at the expenses, a national political party spend around 20% of the expenses for internal, let's say, expenses and functioning, and 80% campaigning, communicating, and advocating. For European political parties, it's the opposite. It's 80% for international functioning on the average, 20% for advocating, communicating, etc. And I think that indeed European political parties became very strong actors as the role of co-legislator here in Brussels, but without, let's say, embracing so far the role of being, as you said, a group of an associations of citizens directly representing them in this kind of democratic process here at the European level. So it was something I wanted to answer on, and on the necessity of the let's say a targeted treaty change. We agree on the fact that and that's will be maybe one of the most challenging discussions that we'll have after the conference. In the framework of the follow-up of this conference, is that for most of the things that we have been discussing since the beginning of this debate, somehow some kind of treaty change will be needed, and we can think of how strengthening European democracy, the role of European political parties without treaty changes. But if we really want to, let's say, move a step forward, we will need at some point this treaty change, that's for sure.
Can I pose a question?
Sure.
Yeah. we don't need treaty change. We need a constitution, and we wanted a constitution in 2003. If we talk democracy, I say again, the necessary, though not sufficient, condition of a democracy is equality of citizens, and the citizens constitute that equal equality in a constitution. Normally, then the wording for this is a republic. Those citizens who agree to be on equal rights constitute themselves in a republic. That's why you have La République Française, Bundesrepublik, Repubblica d'Italia, Respospolita, and so on and so forth. Yeah? It's the citizens which in a given political entity agree to be on equal rights. So if we want this on Europe, and if we want European democracy, basically we need no treaty change, because then again, the states are the actors, so we need a constitution, and the constitution gives us equal rights, and basically then we would be a European republic. But this is the way to a European democracy, because la République et la démocratie, je n'ai pas besoin d'expliquer en français que c'est la même chose. Voilà.
Thank you. I'll move on to Dominic, but also I'm seeing that there's Professor Hicks who has his hand raised, but first Dominic, then Professor Hicks.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. I will switch to Spanish. I think we still have the interpretation. Bueno, yo estoy fascinado por...
This is a fascinating debate, this second part of the discussion. And I agree with what Maria Joao said on how political parties could work, European political parties. And I'm also interested in what Pierre and Ulrike said. In order to reinforce European democracy, we will need treaty changes, but with the understanding the next changes would lead to a constitution, and I agree with that. As for elections and political parties, I do think a lot could be done in the current setup, and I think it's important to point that out. Our proposed electoral law, pan-European constituencies, none of these have required treaty changes. Strengthening and increasing visibility of European political parties, that can be done. An awful lot can be done there in the current framework. Adopting a European constitution is one goal, but before then, no doubt, we'll have elections in 2024. And we want to ensure that these elections are carried out in a much more European manner, if I can put it that way. And looking at transnational lists as perhaps the other side of the coin of more visible and stronger political parties, I have to come back to something we mentioned earlier, that is visibility of European political parties. If we have a second voting bulletin where we have a second list with a transnational party and the name of who you're voting for, this was a step forward. But in this scenario, Sergei would be responsible for a great deal. His responsibility would be increased. He would have to negotiate with national political parties about whose name would appear on this list. It's a completely different game for a European political party. Then a post-electoral scenario where European political parties may play a much bigger role. For example, in a democracy, as Ulrike was saying, in a parliamentary democracy, the leaders of the political parties are the ones who negotiate the makeup of a possible coalition after elections. Is not the prime ministers. And this is something we could do without treaty changes. If we believe that the European Council is the executive, the head of state, the president of the European Council after elections should turn to the presidents of the political parties, or perhaps in this case the president of the parliamentary groups, and saying this is the outcome, what coalition could now be formed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, and I'll move on to Professor Hicks, who's online.
Sir, just press once on the speak button.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, you couldn't hear me. I agree with a lot of what has been said. Let me say a few thoughts about treaty change, and then a few thoughts about the individual citizens participating in parties issue. On treaty change, I think we will have treaty change. I would love there to be a constitution. I agree with Ulrike that, for it to be a democratic union with recognizing individual citizens, we would have to transform the EU from a sort of confederal structure it is now into a proper federal polity with a constitution. What I worry about moving towards another sort of constitutional treaty is there would be referendums in at least 4 member states, France, the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark. I would worry, in fact, I'd probably be willing to take a bet that it would be rejected by at least 2, maybe all 4. And then that would be disastrous for the project. So I think we're not there yet. I do agree, though, with Maria Joao that we should have targeted treaty reform. Article 17.7, which is the paragraph on the choice of the Commission President, if that could be changed, for me, that would be the single most important change for democracy in the EU, which is reversing who gets to propose the Commission President. The European Council gets to propose and the Parliament gets to vote. I mean, the European Council are the agenda setters, the Parliament is the veto player, if you like. I would reverse this. What we would want is it reversed. If it had been reversed in 2019, the Parliament would have taken the initiative to reject Weber, which clearly he didn't have a majority in the Parliament, and the Parliament would have had to come up with an alternative. We may have Timmermans as Commission President, or some other candidate as Commission President, or some compromise candidate as Commission President, as Vestager, whoever. I mean, but it would be far more legitimate in my mind, and it would be still respecting far more the European Parliament election outcome, and would be a really key moment, I think, in the formation of democracy. So for me, targeted treaty change, switch who gets to go first in paragraph 7, article 17. In terms of individual citizens, all political parties have different types of membership: corporate membership, trade union membership, individual membership. Lots of different parties have lots of different types of membership. I don't see why European parties can't also, in addition to being a member of a national political party that then itself is a member of a European party, why we couldn't make more of the idea that we could have individual citizens who could be members of European parties who are not members of national political parties. This could be much more transformative, I think, would allow the European parties to develop an independent identity, independent of national political parties, breaking away from the current situation where European parties are subordinate in terms of their organizational structure and subordinate in terms of their membership structure and subordinate in almost every way to national political parties. In some senses, we have an upside-down political system in the EU. The national level is still the primary level of politics, and the European level is the secondary level of politics. And we're never going to change that unless we start to build direct connections with citizens. So that's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very interesting to see one of the new small political parties at European level that started the other way around, Volt Europa, which is a pan-European political party, which is now venturing into national political parties in different member states. So it's doing the other way around of what we're used to as traditional, let's say, political parties. And yes. Members.
They have not enough national political members that are parties. That's why, and I think they have been the one advocating for more individual members, etc., to have more direct European political party, because indeed, that's a European political association that couldn't be recognized as a party because of the fact that they were lacking national members. But yeah.
Thanks. It's an interesting perspective of a European movement, let's call it, which is now translating into different parties within national context. Are there any other comments, discussion, before I move on to Dominic once again to close the... yes, Ulrike? And then I'll move to Sergei.
Ich habe jetzt in dem Report doch nochmal zurück zu Simon Hicks.
The proposal for a constitution would fail because of the referenda in various countries, Ireland and so on. Well, that's correct what Mr. Hicks says, but if you look at the report on the conference on the future of Europe, then there what might work is that across Europe you have a vote on a constitution rather than going through national referendums. And would that fail? I think, looking at it optimistically, that could fly.
Thank you. Sergey?
Thank you again. Just a few words listening to our excellent experts and panelists with their proposals. I think, after all, the key issue for mobilizing people to vote in the European elections next time will be solving the trauma which we all suffered with the Spitzencandidate. Because all the rest, we may invent all the forms of internal democracy, like, voting of our party members all across Europe for our Spitzencandidate. But why should they vote if there are no guarantees of some kind that this will matter? Because I will repeat myself again. Twice, the message from all political parties in Europe was, now go out to vote to the European elections because you choose the future head of the executive. What happened? Nothing. We failed. After the European elections, especially 2014, it was easy, I would say. But 2019, we ourselves created very high expectations. We said, we shall not vote a candidate who has not participated in this race. What did we do? We bowed to the Council and to the political necessity. Because after all, in the end, in politics, much is about character and giving a fight. If, for example, our group would not support candidate von der Leyen, she would not be elected. We shall have the ball back to the Council. I'm speaking hypothetically, theoretically. That would make the process much more politicized, I would say. So we have to find a way somehow to give form of guarantees, although they're not certain, to the citizens that they will not be cheated. All the rest will be, exercises will not be persuasive for the people.
Thank you, Sergey. And if there aren't any other people wanting to comment, I'll move on to Dominic to give his concluding remarks as the person who has organized this very interesting seminar today. Thank you for being here.
Since I have already spoken in the context of the second debate, I will make it very short, so don't worry. Just apart from thanking, I think this has been a very very enlightening debate, and certainly in a way also very content-driven. No, what Sergey was just saying reminded me of something that I think it's also important in that episode, because it's this episode that we come back all the time. What happened in 2019? No, and you're right on everything you said, but it is also true that unlike 2014, in a moment in which, as I've been told, even Angela Merkel was not in favor of Juncker, but Juncker had the backing of the parliament. And that was decisive. In 2019, we bowed to the Council, but also because we were not able to agree on a candidate. So we gave the Council the free way with von der Leyen. So this is important to bear in mind, because even if we have all, I think, agreed on the value of the new electoral law and the transnational list and so on, that will not be solved by the electoral law if the leaders of the European political families don't take the protagonism away from the prime ministers and they are not able to agree on a common candidate, because then the council will have, again, the upper hand. So I will say that. Now, in the context of what we are now moving ahead, we're voting on the 2nd of May the electoral law. Just a quick reminder, what we are doing that, I said it before, and this is very important again, for this seminar and the second part of this seminar, visibility of political parties and more power to the political parties, because they are tabling the list, they are selecting the candidates, their logo, their name. Second, to have a transnational debate is something, I think Gabi said at the beginning, to go beyond the 27 national elections, parallel elections, so you have a set of candidates that move around the union and they don't only campaign at home on domestic issues, right? But they move around the union and they campaign on transnational issues, climate, digitalization, inequalities, and so on. And third, we strengthen the lead candidate principle. It was because that lead candidate is naturally placed to lead that list. And as Margarita was saying before, you link the party with the program and with the candidate. It was happening in our group meeting yesterday, maybe some of you were there, that René Repassi, our colleague from SPD, said in the campaign of 2019, Franz Timmermans came to Germany as our lead candidate. And Franz speaks German, I think very well. And he said he rocked in the rally. He rocked. Finishes the rally and the sympathizers come to him, come to me, but how can we vote for Franz? Well, technically you cannot in Germany vote for Franz Timmermans. Huh? You're voting for the SPD list that then afterwards, of course, will support him for. So I think it's a fascinating story, the one that René told us. So this is the third, reason for what we are doing. We have also the backing of the discussions in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And as both Ulrike and Pierre mentioned, we have to go also for a new treaty in order to give legislative initiative to the Parliament, to give full co-decision with Council, which we don't have. So those things are going to require treaty change. And in a parallel track, we can go much farther with these ideas on European political parties and the electoral law. So thanks again for, I say this is a matter of conclusion, for your participation, and we will continue the discussion.